enacted by Congress, which presumably would have to be amending the First Amendment. But until then, they're on their knees pleading with billionaires and oligarchs and monopolists in Silicon Valley to censor in the way that they believe is politically advantageous. And this was true, as you said, even before the election. I honestly think, Chris, that one of the most momentous moments of the last 5 or 6 years was when the New York Post started reporting on documents that, to this day, everyone acknowledges are completely authentic. And the intelligence community invented a lie that it was Russian disinformation, which immediately pressured or gave the pretext to Twitter and Facebook to ban reporting. If you wanted to go on Twitter and post a link to the New York Post reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop, which contained a lot of information about what Joe Biden was doing in Ukraine, what he was doing in China when he was the presidential frontrunner, you couldn't even post the link. They had banned it. Facebook algorithmically announced through a long-time Democratic Party operative networks at Facebook that they were going to suppress the spread of that story. That was stunning intervention on the part of Silicon Valley in the ability to do journalism in the election on behalf of a candidate that Silicon Valley overwhelmingly was supporting. And since the Democrats won, every time the Democrats call on Apple or Google or Facebook or Twitter to censor, those companies comply because they're in bed together. There is an alliance between Silicon Valley billionaires and oligarchs and monopolists on the one hand and the Democratic Party on the other, and it's now all about to merge with the power of the state.
Great. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about the incoming Biden administration with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about the incoming Biden administration with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. So, Glenn, let's talk about removing Donald Trump from social media platforms. I think even the shopping network? I mean, and why that's dangerous, a dangerous precedent.
I found it really interesting that numerous world leaders, including ones who have a famously acrimonious relationship with President Trump, stood up and very vehemently denounced Twitter's decision and Facebook's decision to ban President Trump from the platform. That includes Chancellor Angela Merkel, who's a center-right politician with whom Trump has argued and bickered almost his entire presidency. It includes President Lopez Obrador in Mexico, who's a leftist president who very eloquently and vehemently warned that Silicon Valley is becoming essentially a world media leader, something greater than nation states, because and ministers high up in the Macron government in France, obviously, who also don't love Donald Trump, denounced it in similar terms. Why? Because they're extremely concerned that these private tech monopolies, who they cannot battle, the EU has been trying to break up Google and break up Facebook for years, and they simply can't because they're too powerful, are also coming for their democracies. And they know that if Facebook and Twitter can block President Trump from accessing the internet, they know it can be done to them as well and to their countries as well. And the only people who aren't bothered by this, from what it seems to me to be, are U.S. liberals. And I think that the most disturbing event yet, beyond, as we discussed earlier, Facebook and Twitter's unity and the New York Post reporting, is the fact that Amazon, Apple, and Google, 3 of the 4 companies that a Democratic House subcommittee just 3 months ago declared to be dangerous monopolists and illegal antitrust anti-competitors in a really comprehensive report that they issued, united to remove from the internet a competitor to Twitter and Facebook and Instagram that had become the most popular app downloaded on the Apple Store, which is Parler, on the grounds that Parler played a role in inciting or agitating for the Capitol breach and the riot that occurred on January 6th, even though it was their own properties like Google's YouTube and Facebook that played a much, much bigger role. They simply destroyed a competing platform at the urging of people like Congressman Ro Khanna, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They issued demands for it on Twitter, and within 72 hours, Parler was gone from the internet. So it doesn't take much to understand why this is so dangerous, that our speech, our ability to organize on the internet and to be heard is concentrated in the hands of a tiny number of Silicon Valley oligarchs who exist completely outside of the realm of democratic accountability, who operate with no transparency and with no limits.
And your last column, which I subscribe to, was on Parler. Just tell people how they can subscribe to your Substack feed.
Yes, Substack is one of those new independent outlets that gives people the freedom, at least for now, to write and speak without interference. And I left The Intercept and went there, and you can find my writing at greenwald.substack.com. There are other writers like Matt Taibbi at taibbi.substack.com who are doing great work. And I really encourage people to support independent media as one of the key antidotes for all of this.
Let's talk a little bit about, with the powerful tools at their disposal, let's not forget that Silicon Valley was a major funder of the Biden campaign, indeed produced a series of anti-Trump advertisements in the last week of the campaign. All of this was dark money done through a super PAC. Biden has a clear animus towards progressives and the left. If the Biden administration continues the policies of the Clinton-Obama administrations, fails to deal with the rupturing of social bonds and the grotesque social inequality and the misery that has been inflicted, exacerbated by the economic fallout of the pandemic, what do you see happening to voices like yours, like Matt's? What do you see happening to progressive critics who call out the Democratic Party for who they are?
I think absolutely they are very committed to the destruction of any outlets that permit independent voices of dissent. Already, you can just pick up the New York Times this morning, and there's an article about how people who were using Parler, but now can no longer because it was removed from the internet by Amazon, Google, and Apple, are migrating to platforms like Telegram and Signal. And there was a New York Times article laying the groundwork for saying, look, Telegram and Signal are now the venues for this right-wing extremism that has become so dangerous. It's only a matter of time as Substack grows before these groups of journalists that NBC and the New York Times and CNN employ, whose only function is to demand censorship, start turning their guns on platforms like Substack or Patreon and saying, look at the extremism that they're hosting. Why aren't they removing this content that's extremist and radicalizing people and is so dangerous? They want to maintain a monopoly over the dissemination of information, and they're not. And the most shocking part of it is the people who are leading this crusade, this censorship crusade, are journalists, are the people who work at the large corporate media outlets. They're the biggest and most vocal cheerleaders for corporate censorship of anybody because they don't want any other voices competing with their own.
You make a point in one of your columns about the raison d'etre for that. We're talking about publications like the New York Times, is they claim that they're nonpartisan, and you kind of devastate this argument, but lay that out for us. The idea that these partisan outlets, whether the left or the right, are shut down and censored, and there is a direction, the people who seek news are directed to established media outlets like the New York Times as if they are objective. But please explain that fallacy.
So, obviously there has been a lurking question for 15 years now or so with the advent of the internet, which is how is it that media outlets and newspapers can survive when there's so much free content online as a result of the internet? Where can they get their revenue from? It used to be that they could get it from advertisers, but advertisers now primarily go to Google and Facebook, and they collect 90 to 95% of what used to be media advertising money. People are unwilling increasingly to pay for content online, and so these media outlets were in serious trouble. And so the model that they adopted in order to become financially viable was to become a cause, to say, we're not just objective news disseminators because you can get that anywhere. We're going to be devoted to a particular political cause, and because you agree with that cause so passionately, you're going to give us your money the way that you give your money to the ACLU or to some other group that you support. So the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, all these other outlets position themselves as anti-Trump outlets. And everything that they did became designed to appease and aggrandize essentially the Democratic Party, because that is who became their audience. The Democrats are now the audience of the white, affluent, managerial class. That's where you get subscription money from, because of this financial incentive to become essentially organs of or spokespeople for the Democratic Party. Obviously not the socialist movement within the Democratic Party, but the establishment neoliberal one.
And yet the argument is that they somehow aren't partisan. That's the argument that they make to justify diverting readers towards their content.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, because when I began writing about politics in 2005, one of my motives was I did think that this kind of pseudo-neutrality or pseudo-objectivity that the media had long adopted for themselves was destroying journalism. And the example that bothered me the most at the time was that the Bush administration began implementing a system of worldwide torture, and media outlets refused to call it torture on the grounds that, well, the Bush administration denies that it's torture, human rights groups and everyone else around the world says it is. Who are we to decide? We're just journalists. We tell you what one side says, we tell you what the other side says, and then we wash our hands of the question. And that was clearly a corrupting form of journalism, because it precludes the truth. And I always advocated for a more adversarial and honest form of journalism that's willing to call lies from government officials lies. In a sense, they've adopted that, but only in a very partisan sense. They're only willing to do that when it comes to Donald Trump, because that's all their readership wants to hear. You're going to see a radical shift in how the U.S. government is covered now that Biden and the Democrats are about to take over. I'll bet you can count on one hand the number of times CNN will have a client on screen calling a press secretary statement or the president's or vice president's statement a lie or false, because they're not doing journalism, they're doing activism on the part of the Democratic Party. That is the model they've assumed.
Great. That was Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald on what to expect from the incoming Biden administration. Thanks, Glenn.
Great to be with you, Chris. Thank you.